Well, welcome back to the When I Heard This podcast. My name is Nate Robinsoff, and I'm here with Cathy Garland, the co-author of Revelationship, which is a book.
It is a book.
Yes.
Yes, quite a book.
And we're going to talk about the book today. So I have a few questions. I read the book. I enjoyed it. I think it would be a good thing for new Christians to read. Mm-hmm. And there are some questions I have about it, but overall I thought it was pretty good.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good. A lot of blood, sweat, and tears, kind of thing. Yeah. So that's good.
And
A+, I guess.
Yeah. It was fun. Like, because I know your dad.
Yes.
And I could definitely tell the parts where I was like, this is him, this is you.
Did you think that the soaring, poetic parts were me, or did you think the practical, straight up, concise parts were me?
I thought that the parts where the book was explaining the point that you were trying to make with the Bible and history was all him.
Probably.
And then the parts where it was more of a life experience type thing, I thought that part was you.
Probably so.
Okay.
Yeah, that's probably good. Although, he shared some of his stories.
Yeah, he did. Yeah. He did also.
Yeah, he did as well. I think a lot of people thought that the poetic side was me, but they don't know that Dad's a poet.
Oh,
I am
okay.
not a poet, and I am very practical. So
I don't know if I noticed any poetic.
He talked about like the wind. There's the wind hover and some other sort of poetry type things. If it's really has a lot of adjectives in it, more so, then it's from Dad.
Okay.
And if it has very practical, concise language, it's probably going to be more. He can be concise. I'm not saying he's the Amplified Bible or anything like that, but it's just two different personalities definitely writing together. So.
But it was good.
Good.
Yeah.
I'm glad you liked it.
Okay, so I will get into some things later about it.
Okay, all right.
Because that's what we do on this podcast is I nitpick everything.
Go for it.
All right. So the first thing is basically why did you want to... Okay, so the book is, to my interpretation of the book, was that it is a whole bunch of points about where God will meet you where you are, and then the opposite, where you can find God.
Excellent.
Is that good?
Yeah, it's very good. Yep.
So why did you think it was important to write this book?
A
book about this?
Yes. Okay, so for me and Dad, we were talking together. The main reason was because we were feeling that Christians, particularly, it's not written for non-Christians, obviously. It's for people who've already settled in their mind that God does exist and that he must want a relationship with them. And so we feel like Christians can languish in their walk with God if they just have one or maybe two ways that they've been trained to look for God or experience God. So, for example, I have friends who are hunters, and they do not experience the presence of God or a feeling of God's presence or anything that they could point to and say, I just felt the presence of God. If they're in four walls, they can't do it. But if they're out in the woods on a stand for 8 hours in the quiet, they feel God's presence. Absolutely. And so I think sometimes we can look down on people who have that avenue of experiencing God because it's not the traditional church method. But in actuality, experiencing God through nature is one of the sacred pathways, but the church doesn't maybe facilitate it as often as they could. And they should. Actually, I have friends who have even fallen away from the faith because of that very thing that I just gave you. And they're pagans now who go out into nature and experience God because God is present in nature. And so another example is you might know as a Christian, because you've read the Bible, that God sticks closer than a brother and that he's going to be there when you go through hard times. But you won't know it in your heart until you go through it. And so we were trying to make sure that people understand that there are multiple ways that God is going to reveal himself. We couldn't even list them all. I mean, we could have just kept on going. But the idea was be open. God does show himself. He does show up, and he wants to show up. So that's why we wrote the book, mainly. I think the other part was sort of dealing with identity. So Christians have a Christianese. They say, you should know who you are in Christ. And that's a good saying. But if you really don't know God, then you won't know yourself. And we are seeing a lot of people whose theology has not been developed. And so they don't know who they are. And that's a problem.
The nature chapter was one that stuck out to me.
Was it?
Because it kind of seemed out of nowhere with the rest of it. A little bit. Not out of nowhere. It was just like, oh, this is a thing that we're doing. Because everything else is like read the Bible, read history, read, pray. And then it was like, go outside.
Put your feet in the grass. Yeah. Yes. And the scriptures were actually meant to be read outdoors. I think people forget that.
They were?
Yeah. The scriptures were meant to be read outdoors. And there are many, many people who have, we'll call them epiphanies, when they're outside connecting with the Creator in nature. Okay. And it's an enormous way. And try reading the Bible outside. It gives a totally different meaning to certain passages, especially if you're sitting out on a back porch and you can actually see the Milky Way. It's amazing how that clicks differently than when you're inside of four walls getting air conditioning blown down your back.
One of our early episodes was about church hurt, and you talked a little bit about that in your book. Mm-hmm. That was you.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Dad had some too. I'm sure getting fired kind of hurt.
Yes, I read that part. Yeah. But you went through it before you were like 14 or something like that?
Yeah.
Is that the number I remember?
That's right. That's exactly right.
So what
13.
was that like and where did you end up?
So, growing up in church, even being spanked by other people in the church is quite an experience. Okay. And I was always there. I mean, 3, 4, 5 times a week. Okay. We were there. And I loved it. And I loved the people. And early on, it was sort of a Jesus movement, hippie kind of people, if you can remember that part.
Early 90s?
No, this would be like early 80s,
okay.
Late 70s even. Okay. So I was born in 77. So this would be like mid 80s, late 80s.
I think I caught the tail end of it.
Yeah, you probably caught the tail end of it. And so we shared everything. We were at each other's houses. And I mean, it was just like growing up with a huge family. But then the business world took over the church. And I saw it happen. And as someone who was attuned to what was going on, I saw an enormous amount of hypocrisy, obviously, and just people treating other people, abuse. There was abuse, words, gossip, encouraged by particular leaders, like to keep tabs on the sheep. It was bad. And I started to see it when I was 13. And I told my dad, I just don't think this Christian thing is for me. I can see that the people are not who they say they are. Mm-hmm. And instead of panicking, which I think a lot of parents probably do, Dad took me to the library and we checked out a stack of books as tall as I was on most of the major, I'd say all the major religions and most of the minor religions. And so being homeschooled, that was my assignment. And I read through those and I asked questions and I studied, and some of them were kind of easy to get rid of. For example, the Muslim religion was very easy to eliminate because I have no intention of going through some of the rituals that they have for women. Mm-hmm. And I planned on driving a car. So there's that. 13-year-old has every plan to drive at 16. But there were others that maybe took a little longer, like Buddhism and Hinduism. And particularly Buddhism has a lot to say for it until you get past the top layer. And they're like, never mind. But at the end of the 13th year, when I was just about to turn 14, it really became clear to me that there was a Christ and he wanted to have a relationship with me. But the thing that made me do all that was, I think, the hurt from the church. And it came again and again and again. So staying in church meant that I was going to continue to get hurt. I don't know anybody who goes to church who doesn't end up somewhere along the way getting hurt. Especially if you're a leader's child. I think it's just like going to happen. There's going to be pile on. And I did leave that particular church that I grew up in, and it was it was hard. I was the first to leave, and then I couldn't stay anymore. If I stay here, I'm going to hate these people. I've got to go. And I left. And it took me a while, and I never have found that family feeling that I had growing up. And that's really been hard. Mm-hmm. And I've expressed that even a couple of times, like on social media. I just be frustrated. Like when I went to see the Jesus Movement movie when it came out, I was just like, I know those songs. I know those people. That's what I grew up with, that authentic Christian walk with God. And people would ask each other all the time, what is God doing in life? What is God saying to you? And it just disappeared. And it was almost like nobody was talking about the fact that it disappeared. And I was very frustrated that everybody was pretending that we were still going along and it was still authentic. And everybody was just really kind of like this. And I just couldn't do it. So that's my story.
So why did you feel the need to find another religion instead of just not
going
doing
to that
any
church?
of it? Like
that's a good question.
Agnostic, atheism, whatever.
Well, I did look at those. I did look at agnostic. The agnostic thing didn't appeal to me because if God is there, he must care, or he's a really, really terrible God, which I guess would be another possibility. The atheism, I did actually think about, okay, does he exist? But within me, it's clear there's enough witness around me to prove to me that the evidence, when you put it all together, there must be a God, and he must be a good God. I know this sounds stupid, but for me, even little things like flowers, the fact that flowers exist means that there's a really good God, because they don't have to exist. He could have done it any other way. But for a woman like me, flowers matter. And knowing that the little details on the backs of leaves and the lace work, those little kind of details, there must be a God. So that was an easy one to kind of come to. Why didn't I just leave the church and go to maybe like Lutheranism or something else? I don't know. I think I was 13, so I probably couldn't drive anywhere.
Right.
I was kind of stuck. But if you're going to deconstruct, it's a good time to deconstruct. And I feel like a lot of teenagers I've spoken with are deconstructing their faith around 13, and the parents don't know what to do with it. But that's the safe time to do it. You can ask questions. If it's really real, then obviously it can stand up against your questions. So I encourage my kids to ask questions. I'm teaching them to ask questions and to push back on man-made traditions. And I think part of my deconstruction was a lot of man-made traditions. Just had to go.
So one of the things that I bring up to Joseph all the time is that for me, it felt like there was nobody around to answer questions, which is kind of the whole reason him and I do this.
Yeah.
And so who did you ask questions to, and were they willing? And did you ever get like, no, you shouldn't be asking that question, or
the smackdown?
Yeah.
I asked a lot of questions of my parents.
Okay.
Which I know some kids might not trust their parents, but my dad's got a THD, so I figure he better know. So I would ask him a lot of questions, and we would look together. He didn't just give me the answer. We would look together, and we would talk philosophy, and we'd get to the root of things and the assumptions underneath certain things. I remember one time, I don't know, this was probably before I even met your family, but the church was really funny about girls wearing pants to church really early on.
I don't remember that.
Yeah, I think you came afterwards.
Okay.
And
I was also a dude.
Yeah, true. So you probably didn't even notice.
Yep.
Right. You were probably in your Royal Rangers hut,
yep,
enjoying life while I was up with the missionettes getting those stupid badges on that stupid sash. Oh my gosh. Anyway, so we were supposed to wear skirts, and it was this thing about wearing pants to church. It was this leftover man-made tradition. And I said to my dad, I don't see that anywhere in the Bible. And he said, it's not there. I said, well, then I'm not doing it. He said, great, let's not do it. So that was how it was. The Bible was king at our house. If it was not in the Bible, then you didn't have to do it. And so legalism, I have a legalism radar. And so if somebody says, this is what you have to do, and I'm like, that's not in the Bible. And if it's not, I'm not doing it. That might be for their conscience. Maybe they need to do it because God's told them to do it, and that's fine. That's fine. But it's legalism if you tell me I have to do it and it's not in the Bible. In the reconstruction process, one of the things so I was deconstructing certain things and I was reconstructing other things. And one of the main things I came upon was something called absolute surrender. So going to camp every summer, you get this high, from the worship and whatever miraculous things happen there. People getting slain in spirit or crying or whatever. And, you just come from that high and then you come home and it's just like leaks out of you. And he's like, what is it that I'm missing? I felt like I had missed a memo that everybody else knew. And that there was
how to not
have it like leak out of you and to stay strong in your walk with God, kind of thing. And finally what happened was, and this was many years later after I had left the church and I was driving home, the Lord spoke to me. We can talk about that another time, drove into a tree because it was audible and freaked me out. But one of the main things that came to me was a book by Andrew Murray called Absolute Surrender.
Okay.
It basically says all that I am, the good, the bad, the ugly, all that I'm not, the good, the bad, the ugly, I surrender absolutely. And then you're done. There's no yielding. That's a word I don't even understand. That's a traffic term. I don't understand how that has anything to do with the Christian walk with God. I yield. That never made sense to me. But surrender, white flag, I'm all out. That's it. That I understood. And so once I plugged into absolute surrender, the power to stay, the power to consistently be and do and hear and abide, which is another old-fashioned word that I didn't quite understand, that came when I found that book.
You mentioned several times in the book about your divorce.
Ah, yes.
Okay. So you also say several times that God was speaking to you through that process and guiding you through that process. However, I know that getting a divorce is a sin, that they would call it at church. So it was weird to see in a Christian book you talking about how God was speaking to you through that.
Right.
So I guess I don't know what my question is anymore.
That's okay.
But if you could talk about that.
So divorce, there are reasons we're allowed to divorce.
Okay.
Whether or not you say it's a sin, people actually would more say that remarriage after divorce might be where the sin occurs. And there's a lot of debate about this.
Okay.
And that's fine. People can do their research. But in Paul's case, he says when a husband or a wife wants to leave and they don't want to serve God anymore, you let them go. And that's basically what happened to me. He wanted other women. I said no. He said, I'm leaving. I said bye.
Okay.
That was pretty simple. It was like a home Office Depot
so that's
divorce.
Okay. Because that wasn't mentioned in the book.
No.
Okay.
But it was it was a very painful process. I mean, I'm kind of glossing over it. It was a very painful process. I did everything right. I did, other women who might hear this, I was a virgin when I got married. I dotted all my I's. I crossed all my T's. I married someone. I did not even date. I courted. It's that whole thing. I'm not for that, by the way. I'm all for dating and kissing them a few times to make sure it all works beforehand. But the whole concept of I did what I was supposed to do, and it did not work out like it was supposed to. That was the really hard thing. A plus B did not equal C, which was I wanted a family, I wanted the children, I wanted the house with the white picket fence, and I wanted to do all those things. And, I found myself divorced in 20-something because I was married young. I got married very young. I mean, if you're going to be a virgin when you get married, you end up getting married young because that's your choice.
Stats bear that out.
That bears out, yes. So we got married very young, and then I got divorced very young, and then there was a few years where I wasn't married, and then I remarried when I met my current husband, Mickey Garland. So,
okay, well, forget what I said because most people assume that's the Christian reason to get divorced.
I think so. I think that or abuse.
Right.
Right. So abuse can be, And I even lump in financial abuse because I've had a number of friends who have had their husbands be gamblers and just lose their house and their shirt and everything else too. And it's like, you need to at least separate from them. And you have to get a divorce in order for your finances to be separated. So I throw that one in there too.
Well, I'm going to have to dig deeper with that one.
There's actually a really good book on divorce, and it's 3 scholars presenting 3 different views, biblical views of divorce. And then that's the first 3 chapters. And then the next 3 chapters, they debate each other's 3 options. And then one of them actually converts in the book to one of the other. It's an old book. It's like a 1980s book.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's really good. And I read that. I think Susie Shanlian gave it to me, actually. So.
Okay, this was the biggest one for me.
Okay.
That I have questions about.
Okay.
All right, so you have a chapter about reading the Bible, and you have a chapter about praying, and you have a chapter about going to church.
Okay.
And not going to church, about the church.
Yeah,
And,
spirituality and community.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so from the way I read it, it felt like I was being told basically that I do all of these things wrong.
Ooh. Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so because I've heard like the pastor or the preacher or the priest will always tell you how to, like, you have to get in the right mindset when you pray, and there's several books about how to pray effectively. Sure. and all this stuff. And every time I'm like, well, I'm doing it wrong. So should I even keep doing it? So you guys have chapters that I took like that.
Sure.
So why? Okay, so how do you think that if that's in there, how am I not gonna feel that way if I'm being told how to do it correctly? Because basically I just feel like I do it wrong.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I wish I had someone who told me that I was praying wrong, because growing up, none of my prayers were ever answered. And I was like, well, that's not true. A couple of them were, but that disappeared after I was a certain age, it felt like. And I was like, is it me? Mm-hmm. I mean, so if you're praying like most Christians and you're not getting answers, it's going to have to be 3 different things are going on. Either God exists or doesn't exist, and he's not listening. So there's nobody up there listening.
Okay.
Or number 2, something's wrong with you, which is a very real possibility, I suppose. And then the next one is maybe we're doing it wrong.
Okay.
Those are really our only 3 options. So I wish somebody had told me you should not be praying like a to-do list. And so I think I discovered that Christians pray like a machine gun. They just sit back and they spray these bullet prayers, hoping that one of those bullets is going to hit the heart of God and they're going to get an answer. And they don't get answers so much. The church prays and prays and prays and don't get answers, so they have very little faith. And it says, if you have faith like a mustard seed, you can tell the mountain to go into the lake, which is a little crazy, but I have not seen any mountains going into lakes lately. So obviously, we do not have faith. Why? We don't have faith because we're not getting our prayers answered. So what's wrong? That's my thinking. And so, yes, it might hurt a little bit to realize, maybe the church hasn't taught us how to pray properly. I mean, it sounds like you had some instruction, and I certainly saw a lot of people doing it. I mean, I was a part of prayer rooms and things like that, and I did see some prayers answered, like in front of my eyes. Miracles happened, but it wasn't happening for me. Mm-hmm. And so I had to learn I was doing it wrong. And so for me, that was grace to find that out. It never made me feel bad. So I'm sorry that it made you feel bad. But once I found out that it should be a lot of listening and a very little speaking, that just freed me up. So basically, I don't pray anything I don't hear God say. I won't do it. I have come to the place where if I say to God, what do you say about this situation? What do you say about this problem? If he says nothing, I say nothing. There's actually a scripture in the Bible that says, woe to the prophet who goes when he's not been sent. It's in Ezekiel. So I'd say nothing. But if he says, and there's a caveat to that, but if he says something, I say exactly what he says, I pray it, and it happens. So why would I mess around with anything else? If I know he's going to do what he jolly well wants to do, he's going to tell me what he wants to do, I pray what he wants to do, it happens all the time. So why would I do anything different? I don't know. There is one prayer I do pray because people will come up to me in a situation, they're all holding hands and everybody's praying for the little prayer requests. And it's the most awkward thing to me because I have to hear God or I'm not going to pray. So usually I position myself so I'm last. Then I can have enough time to hear what God's saying about said situation or whatever. Or I'll just keep silent. I have done that more and more. Just keep silent because I have nothing to pray because he's not saying anything. So I'm going to keep my mouth shut. And then I do have a prayer that I pray for situations when I'm panicked. So this would be like an emergency situation. And so I don't have the wherewithal to hear because I'm emotional or whatever. And so I'll say, in the this prayer in the power and the authority of the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, in the power and the authority of the Holy Spirit who is in me, whom I receive from Christ, in the power and the authority of the blood of Christ, which has overcome all things, and then in the power and the authority of the Word of God, which declares, and then usually I fill in with whatever the Bible declares about said situation, like healing typically, because my kid's got no blood running out of her nose or something like that. And then I'll say, in the faith of Christ, because I obviously don't have a lot of faith, in the faith of Christ, through Christ, in Christ, I declare. And then I declare it, and it happens. I have seen like crazy things happen. And I joined this Facebook group early on in my kids' lives because they were healthy, and I felt bad for these kids that are not healthy. And so I would pray things. The mom would say, pray that a kidney comes today. And so I would say, Lord, what do you say? And he would say whatever he said, pray through the red tape, or pray that the infections would be gone and that they can receive the kidney, or whatever it is. Or even something specific like urine output or A1C coming to a certain level. I'm not a nurse. I'm not a medical person. I don't know what I'm supposed to be praying. But if he said to pray it, I pray it. And it always came to pass. So I'm like, okay, I'm not screwing with the rest of it. I'm just going to pray this. And that's one of the reasons why we wrote that in the book. The one about reading the Bible, I think Christians in America read it differently than other countries. Okay. In other countries, the Bible...
Because it's in English?
No. Okay. No. That too. But I think it's because it's in other countries, it's their lifeblood. They're under persecution potentially or something like that. We read it and it's sort of this materialistic consumer, I read it for myself kind of perspective. Okay. And so that obviously is not very healthy perspective. And then also we consume it, like people love to read through the Bible in a year. And I'm not against it. Go ahead. That's great. But for me, if I want to get the juice out of what God is saying, I would rather somebody spend a month on a chapter.
Okay.
Before they move on. And really understand what's being said. Eat it. Taste it. Really know that it's good before you move on to the next thing. But what happens is it's just like, I don't know, a race, competition. Like, I don't understand that part of it. So that we also put that in the book to help people understand that there's another way to read the Bible than to just consume it in this materialistic, fast sort of way. But you can do other ways too. It's just that we were trying to help people be open. So you felt a little bit squashed, and I apologize for that. But what our goal was to actually open people who might be from, another denomination. This is being read by a lot of Catholics, and so, because it's by a Catholic publisher. And
Catholics aren't supposed to read the Bible by themselves. Right?
Not as much, they don't really have a lot of instruction on that. And so we were trying to set a table for people. It's like, eat from here, eat from here, eat from here.
Okay. I don't think I necessarily felt squashed. I just wanted to ask you about, like, it seems like you hear so many different ways of doing it from other people, and I just wanted to understand.
And there is a lot of these sort of ways, like they have the different types of prayer, and you got to make sure you pray one in each category. And I'm like, oh my gosh, right. I'll never do that.
Right.
No. The most of my life, it was a to-do list. Like, I'm praying for Joyce, who's having this problem, and I'm praying for so-and-so, and she's having this problem. And I had no idea what was on God's heart. So now I just wait to hear what's on God's heart, and then I pray that.
Okay. All right. So the other part of the book where I felt a little, like, pushed down or whatever.
Squashed.
Yeah, squashed. Was was when you guys talk about having visions and dreams and premonitions, or whatever the right words are. And so, because so those things have never happened to me. So when I hear other Christians having those, I'm like, well, I guess I'm not good enough. You know what I mean? And so talk to me about that.
Okay, so visions, God speaking to you in dreams, God speaking to you in visions, and God speaking to you audibly or in your mind and your heart, and you know it's God. I didn't have that either until he spoke audibly to me. So it came after he revealed himself that way. And it was like, oh, that's your voice. Because up until that point, I had my mom's voice in there, my dad's voice in there, and Lord knows whoever else's voice. I even had my ex-husband's voice in there. Like, it's a jumble in there, right? So when he spoke out loud and he said, if you don't want your life, I do. It was like, oh, that's your voice. And so after that, it was a lot different for me. But I had visions perhaps and encounters and different things up to that point, but I really hadn't heard the voice of God, and I wasn't trained to hear his voice. And I think that's the answer to your question underneath what you just asked me, which is the way you can hear God's voice, the way you can have dreams and visions is by being prepared to receive them and practice. So practice for me, just like any other thing, is I lean in, I make myself be quiet, I take time to be quiet. It really has nothing more than to be quiet. Like, I don't have to read a certain book or do anything like that. It's about quiet, and he comes every single time. And I think for a lot of people who are working and living life and things like that, they haven't had an opportunity to have the time. I bet if you went away to meet him in a cabin on the side of a mountain like I had to, because I was being divorced, and it was do or die, basically. I needed to have him speak. He'll be there. I have no doubt. He would be there with some words for you. But I do think we have to be trained in it. And I do think that's the church's job. And I think it's like 33.3% of its job is to train you to hear God. And the visions and different things we share, again, is sort of like, here's a dish you can eat from. He could reveal himself this way. Be open to that dish. And when we talk about this, actually on the YouTube channel, we talk about prayer. And I do say things like, if you're not getting your prayers answered, you're doing it wrong. Or, so I can see where it can be a little zapping. But my goal for telling people about the visions is to open them up to the possibility of that being the way he wants to communicate. Some people wake up with a dream, and they've had a spiritual dream, and they don't even know it, and it just fades through the day. But I wake up with a booklet by my bed, and I write it down. And my grandmother, whom you knew, she had tons of those, just like journals and journals and journals full of them. And many of them were for specific people that she would share, and then they came true. And it's been an enormous undertaking to read them all. It was so many. I'm pretty sure God kept her on the earth to have someone to talk to, because the rest of us are a little bit busy.
My brain is more logical than feely, and so I don't know how to do these things. And when I hear abstract things like be quiet, I'm like, what do you mean be quiet?
It takes practice.
Okay.
Americans do not know how to be quiet in their minds. The very first time I tried to be quiet, I could not be quiet for 60 seconds. And I'm not ADD. I'm just a normal person. And then I was able to expand it to 5 minutes and then to 15 minutes, where I can get on my knees in a prayer moment and I can be silent in my mind to only receive what he wants to say for a good 15 to 25 minutes. I'm not as good as some people who can do it for hours. I can't do that.
So you mean literally not speak?
Not speak.
Okay.
And not really think either. And if I start to think of my next thing that I've got to do, or my to-do list or whatever, because it will impinge, it kind of pushes it. As soon as I'm quiet, everything wants to talk to me. So I have to say no and be quiet.
Okay.
And then if it starts to, and it's a training thing, if it starts to come in, I turn my mind away from it gently. I don't flip out. The Brother Lawrence's book, The Practice of the Presence of God, helped a little bit with that, but it really was only practice. That's the only way. It's great to read somebody else's experience, and it'll help you know that it's possible, but absolutely the only answer is practice.
My favorite thing that you said in the book, which I can't remember where I first heard it, but I hadn't thought about it in a while, was near the beginning when you were talking about whether God existed even. Mm-hmm. And you said that if God, well, I don't know if it was you or your dad, but you guys said that if God existed, he would have already told us that he existed.
And
right?
Yes.
Okay. So that I always think about that when I think about this atheist scientists who say we just haven't discovered the main questions of why we're here and where do we come from.
Yeah.
And once we figure out the next science, we'll know.
Right.
And so just hang on, guys. We have no idea what we're doing until we figure it out. And I'm like, well, if there's a reason why we're here and we exist, then there's probably a God, and he probably already told us who he was so that we'd be doing the right thing while we're here after he created us.
He wouldn't wait so long.
Right. He wouldn't wait so long. Yeah. So where did you guys come to that conclusion?
Probably Athanasius, who was basically, he's an early church father.
Yeah.
And he was basically saying, I think there was a movement possibly in the early church where the Gnosticism, where God is there, but he's not interactive with us. And so he was kind of addressing that as like, no, he's there. And if he made us, then he made us for the purpose of relationship, to reveal himself, or else why would he have even made us?
Okay.
Yeah. And so I think a lot of times the early church fathers saw the eyes were proof that he can be seen. The ears are proof that he can be heard. The mouth is proof that he can be spoken to, etc. So it's kind of a simplistic explanation of that.
So why was that explanation for why God is real and he exists the one that you chose for the book?
Well, mostly because the book is not for atheists. I've actually had a couple of invitations to podcasts with atheists to debate them. I'm like, I don't have time for that. So
I could pretend to be atheist.
Yeah, we could. I mean, sure, but this is more for. The book is more for people who have already established in their mind that God does exist. It's for, like you said, new Christians who maybe don't know all the different ways that God could be reaching out to them. It's also, I think, for long-term Christians, and I've gotten a lot of feedback from people who have said, this came at just the right moment in time, and I needed a refreshment and a reminder, even of some of the basic things. And then also being open to other things. I had one wife tell me, I specifically was talking about a hunter, and she was like, I have denigrated my husband because he did not want to go to church. And I have said that he really needs to experience God in church. And I have put him in that box, and it's been hard on our marriage because of that. And she's like, I'm not going to do that anymore. She's going to go out on the stand with him. I think it's great. And so when you talk about, why does God reveal him? Is that a proof? Why do we choose that proof? I think mostly because we figure anyone who's picking up this book has already pretty much established he exists.
Like our whole podcast is for people that aren't Christian, basically.
Right.
And so that's where my brain comes at things from, is like, which is why I asked you questions about the about the other two things, because that's where my brain comes from. Is like, people, non-Christians reading all this stuff about visions, are they going to understand that? And so, but yeah, that was one of the things, was me asking you what you thought your audience was.
It's definitely Christians, but it has been read by a couple of non-Christians and a couple who are more part of the Catholic Church.
Okay.
And more would be what I would, growing up, call nominal Christians. They go to church for the community, but they don't really study the Bible or think it's really for them. And so they've read it and it's made them think differently. Several people said that they were touched in certain spots. Like, for example, one of them was when I talk about my son who's in heaven, spending time with my grandfather who's in heaven. And that was a vision that came to me. And it was a very healing vision. Some people ask me, like, why does God even give visions? And I think a lot of them are for healing us. And that vision of my son in heaven playing the piano and doing different things with my grandfather in heaven, and that whole naming thing that I talk about in there, because of the miscarriage, it was like an open wound that never healed. But then when I had that vision and I went through the process with him, it healed. And so I think when I talk to non-Christians about what God is doing in their lives, I'm trying to point out to them, he is speaking to you. It just might not have been audibly in your ear. And sometimes people will say, now that you say that, this happened, and that doesn't seem like a coincidence. I'm like, no, coincidences, I don't believe in coincidences. I don't think it's mathematically possible to have too many coincidences in your life. Mm-hmm. And so I'm like, yeah, I think God's trying to tell you something. You need to go to a quiet place and let him tell it to you. And even non-Christians who believe that there must be a God up there, but they're just not sure of his character and nature, and is he trustworthy, is he good? They haven't answered those questions. They're willing to know that God might be reaching out to them. They need to go and receive. So that to me was an important part of, though it wasn't the goal, it was an important sort of side effect of the book.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had to know when I was reading it that not every chapter was going to be for me. Yeah. But then the ones that were, I breezed through it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which one was your favorite? You said the nature one?
Yeah, I think so, because I just never thought about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't go outside. Because I die.
Well, that could be so, yes. Yeah.
Okay, so you have a blog.
Yes.
Why?
So I started writing
Sorry,
a blog.
I'm blunt.
That's okay. I like it.
Okay, so you have a blog.
You have a blog. Why?
And you write things about stuff that comes to your head.
Yes.
About Jesus.
Mostly.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So why do you write this blog?
I started writing it.
Was that better?
Yeah, that's fine. 10 years ago,
okay.
I started writing it. So before my children were born. It was 10 years ago I started writing. I had just retired from a software company, and I was the COO when I retired. And
do I know which one?
I don't know. I don't think so. Advanced 360 was a learning management system. It was the one I went to after after I left your dad's. Yeah, so I went from your dad's to a learning management startup, and so it had won awards and done its thing, and I'd carried it for 13, 14 years. And towards the end, it was toxic and I had to go. And so I retired from that, and I was made a bucket list of things I wanted to do. And so one of the things was to write a blog. But the main part of that came because I tried to look up how to leave a job well.
Okay.
Google that sometime. It's not good. There is not any really good advice about how to leave a job well. There's a lot telling you to leave.
Yeah.
They're like, if it's toxic, get out of Dodge, and I'm like, that's not what I'm trying. I'm trying to leave well. So I gave them a 2-month notice. All my employees, by the way.
2 months?
Yeah. I gave them I was a COO. You can't replace a COO. Right. So I said, okay, I'm going to leave in 2 months, and you need to start finding somebody. And then all my employees on my side of the house quit in 2 weeks. That was fun. And so I said, I'm going to detail how I'm leaving. And so on the very last day of my 2-month, I shared a blog on how to leave well. And that was well received. And so I was like, oh, okay, interesting. And so sometimes I do write about business.
Okay.
And doing things in business, like how to be promoted from within and that kind of thing. Just because I do a lot of coaching for women professionally as well as spiritually, because the two go together in a lot of cases. So I started writing the blog, but a lot of times it's a 4-minute read. It's like a 5-minute, 4-minute read. It's about the time you've got to go to the potty before your kids come find you, if you're lucky. So you're reading it and you're like, okay, that's enough for me today. So it's meant to be a short burst of theology or thought-provoking something that you can chew on for the rest of the day. So I started writing that 10 years ago. And it's also what we would call practicology. You ever heard that word? No. Okay. No. So it's theology made practical.
Okay.
So and that's a lot of what we did in the book is we're trying to take deep concepts that have been written by church fathers and debated, and we're trying to make them simple enough to put into practice.
Right, okay.
Yeah. So it's a lot of practicology on the thing. But sometimes I'll do something controversial, like when The Chosen had Jesus, the guy Rumi who plays Jesus, he says, I am the law of Moses. And everybody either loved it or hated it. And so I wrote a whole blog on why he is the law of Moses. And why, even though we don't know that he said something that was really bad that got him almost thrown off the side of a cliff. So it must have been bad. And so I wrote a whole blog on why.
Wait, the actor?
Yeah, well, Jesus. He was almost thrown
real
off.
Jesus.
Yeah, real Jesus.
Okay.
He was almost thrown off the side of the cliff in real life.
Oh.
Yeah. He said something. We don't have it recorded what he said.
Oh, okay.
But whatever he said.
He said, I am the law?
We don't know what he said.
Okay.
But in the movie, they made him say, I am the law of Moses, and people flipped out.
Okay.
I loved it. So.
All right.
So the blog can be about all sorts of things. Really.
So where can people find the blog?
So the best place to find the blog is on Revelationship.net. We moved it over there. So it's easy to find.
Okay. So do you have plans for a second book? Because you totally could come up with another list of 14 things and just say, hey, here's how God talks to you and how you can talk to God and make book 2.
Yes.
Okay.
There is a book 2, but it's not going to be about that. So the first...
Well, darn.
I know. Well, I mean, we had to cut it off somewhere. You could do how God reveals himself in beauty. We could do how God reveals himself in art. I mean, you could just keep going and going and going. Well, the reason we came up with the title and started pulling it together was because I was writing a book called The God Who.
Okay.
And so Dad said, I think it needs a preface. People aren't ready for the God Who because they aren't prepared to know God. They don't know that he's going to reveal himself in the ways that he reveals himself. So this is a primer. And the next book is called The God Who.
So I'm going to have you back.
Sure.
Okay.
But the God Who is just in Genesis. All the ways that God reveals himself just in Genesis through people's stories. Or like he loves to say things like, I am the God who does this.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's all over, especially in
the
Genesis.
The God who ...
Okay. Exactly. So it's the God who. And so in Genesis, like even chapter 1 and 2, there's like 40 or 50 different revelations of who he is. And so if you train your eyes to look for the God who's in scripture or how he's revealing himself in a person's story like Jacob or Ishmael or some of these other, Hagar is a good one. A lot of people, because in that story, Hagar's story, you've got injustice, you've got, she's a servant, she's been taken advantage of, she's been kicked out into the desert, her kid's about ready to die. I mean, it's a pretty bleak circumstance. And then God reveals himself, and so she says, you are the God who sees me. And so practicology says, well, if God is the God who sees me, then I am seen. So now we were getting into identity. I am seen. Hagar was seen. And so if God is a God who sees injustice, I need to be seeing injustice and doing something about it. You see, That's how practicology works.
So you could write 65 more of those also.
I don't plan on it.
Okay.
No, I don't plan on it because once your eyes have been trained to look for the God who, then you can go read the rest of the Bible and it'll come alive. I did it because I was having to read the Old Testament again, and it is dry and dusty and bloodthirsty, and I was just like, I'm much more of a New Testament gal, give me Jesus. But I needed to read it, and so I was right before I got started, the Holy Spirit said, look for me like you look for Aslan. That is totally a Christian weird thing, but I read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the whole series multiple times. Love the series. And
the movies are bad.
The movies are pretty terrible.
Yeah.
This is the British acting.
Yeah.
That we can nitpick that together.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, that's pretty bad. But the books are beautiful. And if you recall, every time they have a situation, if they forge ahead, they do their own thing, people die. It's a disaster. But if they would just wait for Aslan, if they would just look for Aslan, things would go better. And so it's like, okay, I'm going to look for God. And then in Genesis 1:1, it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Well, that's an obvious one. God, he's the God who creates. But before that, it also even says the Spirit of the Lord hovered, or brooded is the Hebrew word. And I do know enough Hebrew to get dangerous. And so he's the God who broods over the water. And there's a lot in that. This whole thing in Hebrew about brooding. And it's not what we think brooding is. It's brooding in like impregnating the waters. So that's a fun one. Don't get me started on that. But anyway, so there's a lot of revelation of who God is just right out there for you to glean very quickly. But then also if you study like, Abraham, who was flawed, and you start to see how God reveals himself in his story. Then you start to look at your own story and you're like, oh, I'm seeing where God is revealing himself in my story. Or you talk to someone else, you're like, I see how God is revealing himself in your story. And you can encourage people to look for the God who. So that is coming out, yes, and probably, if I can get my act together, 6 months.
Okay, well, where can people find the book?
Revelationship.net.
Okay.
Or Amazon.
Amazon?
Amazon, yep.
Right.
And the funny thing about finding it on Revelationship on Amazon is Amazon doesn't think it's a word. So you type in Revelationship and it changes it to relationship.
Right.
And so you have to type in Revelationship Cathy Garland and it will come up.
Okay.
And it won't change it to relationship.
Well, we'll put that on the screen.
Okay.
So do that.
Do that.
All right. Well, thank you for coming.
I'm excited.
I'm going to say all my outro stuff that I have to do every time. Well, this has been the When I Heard This podcast. You can follow the podcast on Facebook and Instagram at When I Heard This podcast, and X and locals at When I Heard This. Like, subscribe, share, comment, follow, download. You can tell everyone that you know about the show and ring the notification bell. Also, the website has shirts. What? What is the website? WhenIHeardThisPodcast.com. That's the website. Yay. You can follow me on Facebook and Instagram at Nate Robinsoff. And do you want to say where people can follow you?
Yes, Graceful Musings is the name of the blog.
Okay.
Graceful Garlands is Instagram. And then Revelationship.net. They can connect with me all sorts of different places. And then
all your links are on the website?
All the links are on the website. It's probably the best way. And then on YouTube, we have what we call the Back Porch Talks, where we're just sitting on a back porch, Dad and I, talking.
Right. I didn't ask you about that. That's my bad.
That's okay.
Okay. So what is that?
So that really is just my sister throwing a camera up and saying talk. And so we were answering a lot of the questions. We called it Back Porch Talks because we're on the back porch and we're talking like we do all day long, anytime. And, just about theology and just the book and different things. So
this has been the When I Heard This podcast. And we'll see you guys next time.